what we're going to be discussing in this panel is really the two questions of migration and forced displacements. So basically, people having to move across the world into regions where they hadn't necessarily lived before, either searching for a better life or forced into it by circumstance. So my name is Youre Yusufu. I run the Dangote Foundation. We work on 3 pillars: health, education, economic empowerment, and the 4th one is humanitarian and disaster relief. So this topic falls square into what we've been dealing with in terms of working with, helping out with the IDPs in northern Nigeria as caused by Boko Haram. So what I'm going to do now is, you have the bios of all the speakers in the books, so I'll trust you to read the bios. I think it's more interesting to hear what the panelists have to say and also have some time for some Q&A towards the end. So my first question is for Innocent Chukwuma, Ford Foundation. So Innocent, you have been running the Ford Foundation for a few years now for the West Africa region, overseeing your investments in the region. Your background is on human rights. You've done a lot of work in the whole development NGO space. And so my question to you is, what is it that you think that we as Africans should be looking at in terms of creating opportunities for our young people so that we reduce the flow going to this fake El Dorado, which we know doesn't exist, and lose their lives in the process? What would be your recommendation?
Thank you, Zoria. Good morning, colleagues. I actually see 4 areas that we can look at in trying to deal with this problem. The first is that the African philanthropists need to pay a little more attention to understanding what is driving what in my view, is misinformation and misconception about international migration and migration from Africa in particular. When you read the media, especially in these days of rise of right-wing populism, you get the impression that the world is being flooded by migrants, especially migrants from Africa. But the literature does not bear this out. If you look at the latest data on international migration, the most recent being 2015, we have about 244 million people migrating internationally. And the largest contributor to that is people born in Asia, where you have about 104 million, constituting 43%, followed by Europe itself, if you look at the migration from Eastern Europe. Then you have Latin America and the Caribbeans contributing about 37 million or 15%. Then Africa at the bottom, contributing 14% or equivalent of 34 million. But you don't get this from the media. And then the other one is that migration in general is actually beneficial for the source, transit, and destination countries. So the whole effort is not to stem migration. It's focusing on the unsafe, dangerous, and in my view, suicidal migration, where you have a number of African countries been involved in it. The most recent data shows that Nigeria, Eritrea, the Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire are among the top countries. So the next thing the philanthropy needs to pay attention to is what is actually driving young people to leave their countries and embark on this dangerous route to get to, in your view, El Dorado. I watched a video yesterday about, bodies that were washed off and all of that, So the literature again talks about, the general explanation or economic opportunities or demographics, Africa is overflowing, or environmental factors. Those are important, but in my view, they are underlying factors. The important thing for the philanthropists is to ask, how do they intersect this problem to produce this explosive situation? And if you look at it in that dimension, you begin to see aspiration and opportunity being a critical factor. Because if you use all these underlying factors, the whole of Africa is affected by it. By why are young people in particular countries being more affected. And even in those countries, they are not evenly distributed. In few states and regions, why are they doing that? Aspiration becomes an issue because aspiration is cognitive. It's what affects an individual, how an individual views his opportunities in the world. But the realities on the ground do not bear that out. So when you have that disconnect, or in my view, a delta, young people want to move. Then the other one is, if you like, a tension between national aspiration and individual aspiration. Now, across the world, if you look at the two leading countries, Nigeria in terms of solid numbers, and Eritrea in terms of ratio of migrants to the population of the country. Eritrea, about 5,000 people leave Eritrea every month through this unsafe route. Why did they do that? So you have national policies in Ethiopia that talks about national service. You have a centralized planning in education that requires young people to focus on particular courses. Now, those who don't want those courses, they want to go to elsewhere where they can find it. In the case of Nigeria, we have a quota system that is very good for national policies. But for young people from certain areas who pass their university entrance examination, but because of where they come from, they can't get a placement. You can talk about national aspiration from now till tomorrow, but their individual aspiration is to have a better life. They do that. So the next thing philanthropists in Africa needs to do is what has worked in reversing this trend. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And we have had experiences, for instance, in Nigeria. I think it was between 1984 and 1985 when Buhari came the fourth. He launched his campaign of Around Andrew, checking out. Everybody wants to check out. And they did a lot of campaign about reversing. Where are you going to? Is it better that way? A lot of philanthropists need to invest in this narrative because what is out there is actually not as rosy as people think. And if people can do the same type of hard work that they do here, where they go, believe me in confidence, they will thrive. And then a lot of people are investing in skill education and all of that. It's important, but it needs to be demand-driven. It needs to connect with labor market information, not just offering skills because you have money and you can gather a bunch of young people. They don't connect that way. You need to do. And then finally, this is very important for me, because the forum like this makes philanthropists believe that they can solve all the problems. But as Martin Luther reminds us, philanthropy is good and commendable, but it must not make the philanthropists overlook circumstances of economic injustice that make philanthropy necessary in the first place. So it's well and good to dedicate 1 to 5% of our money to philanthropy. And then we have all these lofty principles. But the sources of this philanthropic income, are they aligned with those of your philanthropic values? Which is why now there's a lot of talk about mission-related investment. A lot of philanthropists need to look at themselves, the role they are playing in the national economy. To what extent are they creating openings for young people and others to have a place, so that this 1 to 5% we give to reverse this thing will not be necessary in the first place. That to me is where there is need for connection. Philanthropists need to align with governments. Philanthropists need to align with organizations in the social sector that are the front line of addressing it, because that's the only way we can have a sustainable solution and make young people growing from Africa realize that they have a hope here. There is no other place better than your home. Thanks.
Thank you. I know. Thank you for that passionate discourse, Innocent. I'm now going to turn over to BC. BC is the co-founder of the African Women's Development Fund. You've spent a lot of time looking at women's issues, supporting women, women entrepreneurs, etc. I wanted to have you say a little bit about the role that women play in rebuilding communities, one, and then two, I think understanding what Innocent just said about young men's aspirations and wanting to leave, what actually drives young women to also be in these perilous voyages? Because everything that I've read, or what I think I know about how women behave, is a complete contradiction with them being on these roads to death. So tell us a little bit about that, and also about how you see women's roles in rebuilding devastated communities in the wake of natural disasters.
Thank you very much, Zuera. Good afternoon, everyone. Was it still morning? Yeah. I will speak briefly about issues to do with migration and then segue into a conversation around natural disasters. I'd like to correct an impression. I think the things that grab our attention are the things that are put out there in the international media, on CNN, the BBC, and so on. And decisions are made as to when those issues get to be a priority or get to be highlighted. Maybe when it gets to the stage of thousands of bodies washing up on the shores of Europe. I happen to know that women have been migrating for a long time, probably in larger numbers than men. One of the first organizations I worked with in the international women's movement was an organization established by African women based in London called Akinamamawa Africa. It means solidarity for African women. And the reason why Akinamama was established was to deal with the large numbers of African women based in the UK and who were also in other parts of Europe trying to deal with the impact of those communities on their lives in terms of them being migrants, asylum seekers, and so on. And we've always had stories of women from different countries in Africa being conned into sex work. I prefer to call it commercial sex work as opposed to the value-laden prostitution. And these women get involved in, in these, sex industries and the porn industry. They get involved in drugs. And the situation was so bad, according to the reports that we were dealing with and we had to work with, was that even when they got pregnant, the pimps allowed them to deliver their babies and would take their babies away from them in the hospitals to sell the babies. And these are things that were happening in the 1980s, 1990s. So back to the present day. Why do women migrate? For the same reasons as men do, in search of a better life. And if we look at what it means to be a woman in many of our countries in Africa, in spite of all the advances that have been made, in spite of all the normative frameworks, the international human rights guarantees that our countries or the continent as a whole, through the African Union, has committed themselves to, there's still lip service when it comes to promoting and protecting the rights of women. Women are still largely voiceless. We can hardly find them in places of decision making. We have outliers like countries like Rwanda, South Africa, and so on. But if you look at a country like Nigeria, which describes itself as the giant of Africa, we have only 5.3% of women in our National Assembly. So when women don't have a voice, when they do not have a means of livelihood, when families who are very poor decide to educate the boy child if there's an opportunity for someone to be educated, and the young girl is sent out to go and hawk oranges or bread, guess what happens to her? She falls into the hands of hoodlums, she gets pregnant, and then the cycle of poverty and exclusion continues. And we listen to a lot of young women who have been trafficked out of the country. They tell you heartbreaking things like, where I was in my home state of Edo State or in my home state of Lagos, I was virtually a prostitute. I was having to sleep with men for money, and many times they wouldn't even pay me. So why don't I go and why don't I relocate myself to a place where I would actually be paid for what it is I do? It's heartbreaking. And so my take on it is, just as my brother Innocent has said, we need to look at all the structural issues around us and try and see where we can interface as philanthropists. As philanthropists who want to be seen to be doing good in our communities, I don't see how we can achieve any of our development goals if we don't invest in women and girls. Then on the issue of disasters, I see that this panel has a qualifier, natural disasters. I was at a conference roughly 8 years ago, and it was the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. We met in Johannesburg. And there was a conversation around what makes an African philanthropist different from a philanthropist in other parts of the world. What's the difference between an African philanthropic institution and one based in the US. What's the difference between a Gates Foundation and a Dangote Foundation? And we thought about that for a while. And then a couple of hours into the conference, I got my answer. I was having a conversation with a woman who works with an American foundation with an office in South Africa. This conference I'm talking about was in January of 2008. And she told me very proudly, we have already allocated all our resources for 2008 in January. And I thought to myself, now I know the difference between an African philanthropic institution. We cannot be African grant makers or African philanthropists and not leave room for the realities of being Africans. We have disasters every day. We have so-called man-made disasters, and we also have other kinds of disasters, conflict and so on. So some of the things I'd like to recommend very quickly is, one, we all need to develop some form of internal capacity to respond to crises, to respond to disasters. Secondly, we need to use our voices and our power of convening to insist on political will, to try and make all our structures and processes which are dysfunctional due to politicization, corruption, bureaucracy, we need to get them to work for the people, because we do have certain agencies and processes in place, but they don't work. So we need political will to get that done. And we also need to engage citizens, because at the end of the day, it's African citizens who are the front lines of responses to these issues, Ebola and so on. And their stories get unsung. It's when saviors drop in from other parts of the world, that's what makes headlines. So we need to change that narrative and make sure that our people get the credit and that people stay involved and engaged.
Thank you very much. Again, another impassioned plea. So Ambassador, you have your work cut out for you. I wanted to ask you, how do you see, let's say, the governments of the countries where our people are moving to? Understanding what Innocent said about the numbers not necessarily being, the narrative isn't matching the facts, but still, the people who migrate are migrating in ways that are unsafe and difficult for them. What would be your recommendation about what we could do to work with governments in North Africa, in Europe, across the world to, in a way, hold hands and make sure that people aren't drowning in the sea? What would you say?
You know, the heart of your message was, if you're a philanthropist but you're not a citizen, you're not doing your job. And the last and the most important part of your message was, if you're not connecting with the citizens of a place and you're not from that place, you're not doing your job as a philanthropist. I think that it's not just the role of other nations, it's the role of every nation. Let me give you just two numbers. Today, the population of this part of West Africa, Nigeria, is about 180 million or so. A projection says that in a few years it will be 450 million. So the number that matters is either that difference or something more important. Each one of those citizens. That's the number that really matters. And I think that was, when we talked before, that was your idea, that you got to pierce through everything else and think about the individual person and what's motivating them. Whether they come from a place where there is a well-established illegal trafficking network, because this kind of migration is a big business. And at its heart, it is profoundly corrupt, because it trades on people's hopes and it destroys people's lives all along the way. So for me, if we have a challenge today to make sure that all across the world and all across Africa, each citizen, with the support of their government and the support of other philanthropists and donors, is getting to that point where they can make their life better and the life better for all the people that they love. If that's a challenge today, when Africa represents roughly 1/8 of the world's population, It will be an extraordinarily greater challenge in 2050 when Africa might represent 20% or 25 or more, and when the youth of the world will predominantly be African youth. So that's how important this conversation is. So if I could, because this is about the nexus between government and philanthropy, let me give you a couple of quick thoughts. The first is that every government realizes that we can't allocate all of our money for disasters the year before, and we sure don't have it pushed out in January. So every government is looking with the resources that it's given by its citizens, including philanthropists, it's looking to respond quickly to an emergency. When a natural disaster happens, like flooding here in Nigeria or all those hurricanes in the United States, everybody looks to government to be the first responder. But then, minutes later, everybody says, first, what are the citizens of that place doing? How are they coming together? How are they communicating with each other? And there's a remarkably important role that philanthropists can play in that very split second after a disaster takes place. They can track what governments are doing and communicate with other citizens. It's in fact the core of the kind of citizenship that makes small towns in America, like the one that Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz came from, makes them special. Those "there's no place like home" communities are made such, not how they do in good times, but how they respond to a crisis. And then they can take the baton from governments and move forward. So I've got 3 suggestions to all the philanthropists in this room. The first is that each one of you recognize explicitly that you're citizens first, and then philanthropists. And whatever country you're from, including those of West Africa and all of Africa, you think, I've got to model being a citizen first. Am I paying my taxes? Am I in favor of making sure that the trees that are uphill on the slopes of the Mambilla Plateau or in other parts of this country that are upstream from perennial flooding, are they being cut down? So first, think citizenship at home. Every big part of it. Second, if you're operating in another part of the world, absolutely, the number one rule is reach out to the citizens of that place. A few years ago, I realized that one of the greatest things about a sunset is that every human being in the world can watch a sunset at the same time for free in their time zone. Today, powered by the internet, we can go further. Every human being in the world can listen to the same song or get the same idea delivered at the same time. But the test of our citizenship is not whether we can see beauty or hear it from a distance, but rather how we respond to it. It's that two-way communication. It's the light in a fiber optic cable that connects us. It's not the one-way light from the sun. So I think that if I were a philanthropist, I would be thinking on a daily basis, first, what you mentioned last, and that is, how do you connect the citizens of a place every day with their government in a better way? In order to do that, I would first listen both to their government and to them and see how I could do it. Second, in those places that have been particularly hard hit by disasters, I would go in and I would say, what are you doing to connect with the people of this place who are looking for a way to make a living and not finding it? And I was told by a wise man this morning, Stuart, it's not just jobs, it's attitude, it's culture. So there's a mentoring function. I don't know why it is that some god of news decreed a long time ago that the paper and the radio and the television would have 98 parts bad news, and then, just to lift our spirits up once a week, 2 parts good news. This happens all the time. But I would urge some of the philanthropists here to take the role model examples of the good news in the communities where you seek to do good and broadcast them. amplify them, and then connect in a way that mentors, so that individual citizens and other individual citizens with their government see how it is that they can work together better. And then the last point I would say is this. There is, in my view, nothing as fundamental in life as working with another person to create the opportunity for that person to take care of themselves and the ones that they love. So if every day all the business women and men who are philanthropists in their spare time are growing their businesses in a way that adds lasting value and creates opportunities for entrepreneurs and farmers and others alike, that's an extraordinary contribution. So I'll close with this notion. There's a big debate going on in the world today. How can you raise income? Henry Ford addressed this issue a long time ago. He raised wages. Others have addressed this issue in a way that I think maybe is in better keeping with our time. And that is to think about how you make the people that you work with shareholders or stakeholders in what it is that you do. For me, that's true of an industry. That's the answer to how we get greater wages in the world. And it's also true for philanthropists. Your shareholders and your stakeholders are the sources of your funds, the people that work with you, the people that you serve, and the relationship between the people that you serve and their government. And unless you're playing on all of those fields, the chance of you having a lasting effect is low. But when it comes time to tell the story, I urge you to share that good news, not 2% of the time, but 100% of the time, to inspire people to make wherever they live, like that place in Kansas for Dorothy, no place like home. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. Lamia, I'm going to turn to you. So you work with BRAC, which is one of the biggest NGOs in Southeast Asia. I was thinking about what to ask you, and I realized that we have a lot more in common. I know you work for Africa, for 5 programs that you're running here in Africa, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think the lessons are that we could learn from how successful your organization has been, given that we have a lot of the same challenges? This whole discussion around IDPs, you have the same thing with the Rohingyas coming to Bangladesh, fleeing Burma, coming to Bangladesh. So very similar to refugees running from, here to Cameroon or from Niger to Chad, etc. So tell us what your thoughts are around what we could learn from an organization like yours.
There isn't one here. I think it's afternoon now, so good afternoon, everyone. So I think that's an excellent question for me because BRAC actually began working in Africa in 2006, and the idea was very much to learn from whether some of the solutions to poverty and social exclusion, which BRAC had spent 30, 40 years applying in Bangladesh, would work in some of the contexts that we work in Africa. We work in 2 countries in West Africa, not Nigeria at the moment, and 3 countries in East Africa. So several of the solutions that we had found workable in Bangladesh and very successful and were scaled up were applied here, and some of them have worked very well. I would say our microfinance program is one that has been scaled up and is working very well, particularly in Tanzania and Uganda. We provide microloans 100% to women, and we provide small enterprise loans to develop businesses, and those are equally to women and men. And that program has really been successful. That is a self-sustaining program. BRAC's approach to poverty alleviation is that it's multidimensional, so we need to address an array of issues to solve the problems of poverty and social exclusion. But the platform that it's built on is the microfinance platform, because that's self-sustainable. The loans that are given are repaid almost 100% in all cases. And so that program is able to generate profit, which then allows it to expand and reach many more women and men who are financially excluded. Another really important program, which is also one that is a favorite of mine and which I think people will be talking about and have already talked about, is addressing skills for young people, particularly adolescent girls. We've got a solution which is basically a combination of life skills and livelihood skills together, has been found through intensive research to be very successful, and that's a program that we're had developed in Bangladesh, but has been very much changed. And I would want to highlight here that adaptation and contextualization has been really key. Of course, we wanted to test whether poverty solutions are applicable from one part of the world to another part of the world, and this one has very much been adapted and is very different from the program that we ran in Bangladesh. And finally, I would say that BRAC is really focused everywhere we work on building the resilience of communities. I think while we might not be very well known to many, we're quite well known at community level, where we work really with the communities. We have community level volunteers working with us, particularly in health and education, where our primary role is really to support government systems. The community resilience building has been something that has also been applied and working well here, and we really focus that through our agriculture work and trying to develop agriculture, particularly involving youth back into agriculture. So these are all programs which are really addressing improving the social and economic conditions where people live. And of course, that in terms of migration, the point that you raised earlier, building resilient communities also helps those communities to address disasters or emergencies when those occur in the communities, whether they're a natural disaster like a flood or an insurgence of new people into the communities. And BRAC is working on the Rohingya refugee response, where more than 600,000 people have come in from neighboring Myanmar. And we're working on, particularly on WASH and health to support the communities there. And that is something that we would like to do here as well. We're starting a program in Uganda to address the South Sudanese refugees who have come to live in Uganda. So, and the Ugandan government is very welcoming to the refugees and has provided not just a place, but also livelihoods opportunities, and we're going to work to support that. So a lot of the, I would like to say that a lot of the solutions have worked well, but they've been very much contextualized, and the way that we've done that is really through local ownership and building local leadership. But what we want to do in future is, because a lot of our programs are supported by philanthropists, to really partner with philanthropists as well as with local NGOs, and really channel more funding to local NGOs to support our work and contextualize our work.
Thank you very much, Lamia. Thank you. Innocent, one more question to you. Is there any specific work that the Ford Foundation is doing to address the issues of either migration or natural disasters?
Thank you. We have a number of programs that speak to the larger factors and drivers around migration or natural disasters, even though they are not framed specifically as responding to these issues alone. One that comes to mind in terms of narrative is actually a project that we began earlier this year, and we are at this moment seeking for partners to work with, which is an opportunity to pitch with philanthropists and philanthropic organizations here who may be interested in it. It's called, for want of a better term, Africa Retold Project. It's essentially mobilizing Africans, especially young people, to tell our stories and tell them in a manner that is more nuanced and not be trapped into the extremes of the stories you hear now, which is either you're on the tangent of Africa is a hopeless country, or that Africa is rising, as if Africa is a country, and the reality is more in between, country specific, and even within countries, regions and states specific. And we have one of the activities there is the fellows. We've actually identified the first set of fellows, a cohort of 11 people drawn from across Africa, and each of them, their personal stories has a lot to add to what the project is all about. I give you a typical example of the one from Nigeria. Her name is Trisha Mubani. She's reputed to be the first writer of international repute that got her international book deal while she is living here in Nigeria. So you don't have to go to Europe or go to America to be recognized. And through that project too is invest in researches that better tell the story. Like the one I shared with you earlier. Yes, Africa has a particular type of migration problem dealing with forced, unsafe, dangerous, if you like, suicidal one. But Africa's contribution to the global migration story is not as extensive or deep as it's been made out to do. And that in general, migration is important because that's the way the world grows from time immemorial. So the Africa Ritual Project is one that is very important to us, and we make sure that all the partners that we are speaking to or have signed on to that project are only African philanthropists. The Strive Material Foundation is involved. We have a meeting, we've been talking with the ACAD Foundation set up by Access Bank and similar people and organizations around Africa to take charge of our story, because narrative is important, narrative is powerful. When I was doing a high school commerce, they say if you do not tell people here I am, they will not say there you are. And in many countries today we run to, take for instance in India, with all the success stories you are hearing, a number of states they are still trapped in wars, Maoist rebels and all, but you don't hear all of that, you hear about the rising stories. So we need to better tell our stories. Then the other one, which is also key to this discussion about addressing the underlying factors, is our program called Youth Transition, where we are investing at a particular important phase of young people's life, which is transition from secondary education to tertiary education, where a majority of young people fall off the crack. You take Nigeria, for example, every year about 1.8 million Nigerians register for the university entrance examination. Before sitting for that exam, 70 to 80% of them have failed in quote because the combined spaces available for admission in Nigeria can only take about between 300 to 500,000. I have to check my figure because every year private universities are being registered. But that tells you that a huge number. Now, it has given rise to a category of young people whom if you ask them, what are you doing? They say, I'm writing JAM, as if JAM is a profession. And because there is no, there is no alternative way of them to be skilled in such a way they can be civically engaged and also earn well-being, they fall into all kinds of pressures, including the forced migration and all that. And also under that rubric, we are engaging building what we call ecosystem approach, because the way skill development is done in this country is all supplier driven. It is not informed by any labor market intelligence or information. Governments every year vote money to train young people, whether the skill they're acquiring is one that is demanded. So we're building an ecosystem that involves stakeholders in government, private sector, social sector, and we have a partnership with the Niger Delta Development Commission where we are trying this. Again, it's a framework that has worked, and also promising. Then the other one is to also research. Now, this is something the Lagos office is interested in. It's not done globally. In countries that have all these policies to bridge gap about education, gap about employment, and all of that, is anybody actually evaluating those programs to find out whether they have achieved their purpose? What are the challenges? You look at quota system in this country. It's been implemented for 57 years now after independence. I'm not aware of any study that has shown, has the gap been bridged? Where are the gains we have made? Where do we need to better focus? Because how these policies are impacting on young people is amazing. Kadura Ahmed told us a story in a convening we had, or we participated in about a month ago in Abuja. She went to Umuahia, Abia State, which was when Nnamdi Kanu was reigning, to talk to young people who are lured to this Masob or iPod movement. Alternative could have been running out of the country, to understand why are they involved in it. And there was a story she told about a young man. She said this person said she sat for GCE and the secondary school exam and made 6 A's. He sat for JAM. You have 4 subjects graded over 400. He scored 240. His home state governor gave him scholarship to go to university, but the problem was getting a university that can give him admission. Now, he went to all the federal universities of technologies in this country because he wanted to read engineering, and he was told clearly that because of your home state, you didn't meet the cutoff point. He scored 240. And this young man was seeing people from various areas, especially the catchment areas, that are being given admission when with 200, some even less than 200. And he told Kaderia, he said, after all of this, I concluded there's no future for me in Nigeria. He could have gone through any of these routes. So people are being affected by all these policies that are well-intentioned, but we need to find a way of implementing them in such a way that they can achieve our purpose. So I'm happy to talk to people who are interested in it.
Thank you, Innocent. Okay. So we've heard from our panelists. I see we have about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we have time for questions. I know that often, that's one of the things that I don't like, is we go to a panel discussion, people talk, and then people want to ask questions. It's like, we have time for one question, and then that's it. And then you try to catch up with the panelists at the end, and you never get a chance to. So I am now opening it up for Q&A. So we have the hostesses and the ushers around the room. If you have a question, please say who you're directing your question to, and we'll take 2, and then we'll see how that goes. First question? Oh, you're giving the microphones?
My name is Ndidi Muneli, and I'm a social entrepreneur. When we were designing this conference, Mosu had a great idea from this panel, which he shared with the board, which is we're always so reactive when we have natural disasters. Is there a possibility to create a fund created by African philanthropists, funded by African philanthropists, so that we can be more proactive in responding to natural disasters or man-made disasters? And I want to throw this to the panel. How would it be structured? Who is ready to put down money? Thank you. Nobody's clapping.
BC, you want to answer? My only question would be, who would manage the fund?
One of the notes I made in preparing for this session was to float the idea of the African Philanthropists Forum looking at something along the lines of the Disaster Emergencies Committee that they have in the United Kingdom. The big international NGOs came together, ActionAid, Christian Aid, Oxfam, Save the Children, the usual suspects. And they decided that instead of going round to people for appeals every time there was a crisis, have a specific emergencies fund that they would all pull resources into, or that appeals from the general public could go into. And the way I understand it is it's hosted by one of the partners who set up the consortium. So who manages it shouldn't be a problem. It can be based within an existing foundation. But I would like to advocate that that's something the APF should consider very seriously, because as I said earlier, we live on a continent where things happen, and we need to be able to respond effectively and be proactive instead of reacting all the time.
When I talked about cutting trees down above rivers and towns that are flooded on a regular basis, I was talking about getting to the left of the problem, getting earlier in time. I think that there are two responses. One is, how can we prepare, as you've just described, so that we have a fund ready so that, like governments, we can move quickly. But the second is, how can we look at those things that we can control, like building standards in a tornado zone, or how we make sure that in communities people keep the waterways clear. How can we identify the shocks to our body's politic in every country and move upstream? And I think that what is particularly important here is connecting government and citizens and the private sector, all three again, so that you can say, when the disaster occurs and the lives are rescued and you've got a moment to think, is there anything that we could have done together before this happened so that these lives were not lost? And that kind of analysis is often very specific, but it speaks to the broader challenge that I know that you all are dealing with, and it's one that we've talked about today, and that is, how do people who love mankind, philanthropists, how do they get upstream? And the answer is, they've got to do it with others. The answer to the question in Nigeria is often, how do you scale? How do you come up with a job training or other solution? How do you handle the challenges of 1 million people instead of 1,000? And the answer is us.
Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
In response to that, I would say it would be great if there was a fund set up for that. But from working with communities, what we can say is communities are the first responders. They themselves have a number of coping mechanisms themselves. And if there was a fund that could quickly enable communities to support communities to do that which is beyond their coping capacity, that would be excellent.
It's just to say that you may not call it a fund, but there's something close to it that was launched in this country a couple of years ago around flood. And all our big pocket philanthropies contributed to them, and there were talks about sustaining it. So it's to find out what happened to that, because newspaper reports suggest that they did not exhaust the money that they collected, although some who pledged have not redeemed their own. So if you set up a fund, you also have to deal with issues around free riders who will make these pledges and will not redeem them. But that underscores the importance of having a framework that is legal with professionals running it that will increase confidence, because a lot of Nigerians are losing hope in pulling funds to all these centrally put together funds that accountability is sometimes an issue, both from state and non-state actors as well.
Thank you very much, Ndidi, for that question. We'll take another. Yes, there's somebody there in the middle.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Emeka Osai. I'm a social entrepreneur, and I also help undergraduates become entrepreneurs, and I teach entrepreneurship at the University of Ibadan. I'm a little worried about when I look at economies, like top performing economies, and you look at the number of entrepreneurs that they produce, you'll be able to see that they are high net worth individuals. But what has happened in Africa is you don't have so many people, in terms of high net worth individuals who are participating in philanthropy. So I'm wondering, is there a way we can innovate around this? For example, how do we build tribes of philanthropists around the country? A typical example, 1004 is here. Can we get into these communities and then they have their own social projects as well? We can have advocacy. Kuramo Primary School is here by Eco Hotel, you know, and how do we get people to form tribes all around the country or all around Africa to begin to participate? Because most people feel that, oh, until I become like General T.Y. Danjuma, you know, I really can't do this. Until I become like Mr. Tonyeko, or, you know, I really can't participate. But, you know, just saying, corroborating what the ambassador said earlier in terms of citizenship, you know, and philanthropy, how do we galvanize a movement of people on the grassroots level to be socially responsible to the problems around them? Because what has happened to the mind of the African is he wants to get into school, at best maybe go to an Ivy League school so he can drive a Prado Jeep, you know, and then he has a tinted glass, so he does not see the problems in his immediate environment. And then he can move to the island. In like Nigeria, you want to move to the island, you know, at some point. So how do we ensure that people at the grassroots level are active participants in a movement of building philanthropy? Because when we have more numbers of people, we'll realize that we might be able to tackle these problems in a much more creative way. Thank you.
There's another question. Where? Yes. Yes. Thank you for that question. In the meantime, yes.
I didn't complete the final thought with this final point, but I think that the answer to the question, how do you network philanthropy, not only within a country, but the world around, is to tell the story, to make sure that people know what other people are doing, and then to connect them. You know, I talked to investors who are thinking about investing in Africa, and one of them remarkably said, you know, Stuart, my fund is looking for $100 million investment minimum. We'd really prefer 250, and if you could do $1 billion, that would be great. And it's a wonderful thing, but there's no reason why African philanthropy has to follow in every step philanthropy in other parts of the world. I think it's important that we learn from what others have done, but we don't have to follow it. We now have all these networking tools that we didn't have a while ago. But I think the heart of all those tools is this: tell the story, connect to each other, so that it's not just, I've got your contact information, it's I know what you've done. And that story needs to be told not only to businesses and to philanthropists and to citizens, it needs to be told with governments. Because as a practical matter, the single most important thing in life, after taking care of yourself, is building the bonds of trust with another person. And what philanthropy can do at its highest and best is it can cause all of us to say, in my heart, I know I can trust that there's someone else out there who cares for me and my family. Expanding the ambit of trust from your family and your community to your nation and beyond is the greatest goal I think that the world has. But we now have tools that we've never had before, and philanthropists can occupy this space or operate in this space in a way that they've never been able to tell the stories before.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was a really good question, actually. And I do agree, you don't have to wait until you're wealthy to give back. And I think all of us understand that to some degree because we're all involved in helping somebody else, right? So we don't call it philanthropy when you pay for your cousin's school fees. We don't call it philanthropy when you're paying for somebody's medical bills. We don't call it philanthropy when you, at Christmas time, make sure that people have what they need, or around Salah time, have what they need. So all of us are doing some giving. It's just not structured in a way that we recognize it as philanthropy. And that idea about us building a grassroots community of giving, that's what we've always done. I mean, I remember stories from when I was younger of, you know, the village coming together and giving a scholarship to the smartest kid to go to medical school. And even the person whose kid wasn't smart enough to get the grades to go to medical school would still contribute for that child to go. But then that kid would come back and now support the village, and that whole community network of supporting one another was always there. So have we lost that along the way? I don't know. But it's definitely something that we already know how to do and that we're all doing at our individual levels. And definitely there's no need to wait until we're rich to give back or wealthy to give back. Madame had a question over there. Oh, thank you for that. Go ahead.
My name is Lola Dari. I'm the president of Chestrad, and I also direct a platform called I Will Give Africa. I think the recent discussion has really amplified what I wanted to bring forward. Innocent, we need to tell our stories. But it's not only
Lola,
young...
speak up, speak up.
It's not only young people that can tell these stories. There are many stories of community giving, like the one you've identified now. When we held the Abuja conversation on philanthropy, people came from all over Nigeria, and there's a lot of community action that is giving now to micro disasters, major disasters that we need to capture in that story, because we can learn a lot about what works and what doesn't work in local philanthropy by telling the story. So I think this meeting gives us an opportunity to tell the story of African philanthropy differently. It may not always be about very wealthy people, they're important, but it's also about the local catalysis of philanthropy that comes together to make a big difference. There's an opportunity for Africa to do this now, and I think we should take advantage of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola. Thank you. We have, I think, our last question, because I see it says there that our time is up, so you get the last question.
Thank you. My name is Tendai Commander. I'm CEO of an organization called Triumph Africa, and we advocate for older people in Africa. My question is to the ambassador. I live in the United Kingdom, and there is a group of people who are undocumented migrants. They don't get covered by state provisions, and they're in this category where they don't have a citizenship and they've left Africa or wherever else they are. Is there a role in African philanthropy that extends to outside the borders of Africa, but to citizens and people who are Africans? And I think we like to say in Africa, once an African, always an African. Does that apply once you leave the borders of Africa? There is a case in the United Kingdom where a woman and her daughter starved to death. There were no provisions for her legally because she was not a documented migrant. And there were no provisions there. So is there a role to play between governments to support those undocumented migrants?
You know, if that saying, if I heard correctly that the saying is once an African, always an African, welcome to our whole world. Every single person in it. I think that the core of your question is, at what point should our care for other people stop? And the answer is nowhere. Our care should span the globe. And it should be care not because of color or race or speech or family, but because we're people. And I was thinking in Nigeria, today there are people who are terribly distressed, rightly so, because they don't see what the next step of their life is after they don't get into the university. But the answer is an awful lot of people who have been extraordinary successes in life never went to a university. I heard Mr. Ndima the other day from Borno State note that he had a lot of PhDs working for him and he didn't get past high school. As a practical matter, people need to know that the path to success in their life is not a single path. But here's an idea for all the philanthropists out there. If you would like to raise the world up, first we have to make it more secure. And if you would like to make it more secure, that has to be done one person at a time. Right now, in Nigeria, and other places around the world where there's some insecurity outside a spot, there's a marvelous opportunity for everybody who cares about women's education and girls' education, health, the environment, construction, skills training, philanthropy, spirit, literature, art. There are people who temporarily have been concentrated in places where it's more safe, not just here, but around the world. The challenge is to take advantage of the negative of people being concentrated in a place to do something. You all came to this place today because you were looking for a way to make the world a better place. there are, in displaced persons and refugees and a poor woman on the streets of a city, in the United States or Europe or anywhere else, there are people in need around the world, but when they come together, as we have here, it presents an extraordinary opportunity. In Nigeria, we might say, make Borno better today, one person at a time, or Yobe or Gombe or Adamawa or parts of Bauchi. But it also applies as much in Port Harcourt or Ogoni or any of the other places around the world. So the easy answer to your question is absolutely.
Thank you very much. Please join me in giving a round of thanks to our panelists. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, BC. Thank you, Lamia. Thank you, Innocent. And I would like to introduce the next session, which is exploring collaborative approaches to end neglected diseases in Africa, moderated by our own Ndidi Nwuneli. Okay, thank you.